This is the editing room of a scholar, a professor of philosophy. His name is Huston Smith. For 6 months, Dr. Smith has been doing research on a special project and recording his findings on film. His purpose has been more than usually serious and profound. He's made an attempt to discover America's own moral answers to 16 of the most basic public and private issues that Americans face. In his search, Dr. Smith has traveled thousands of miles and asked literally hundreds of questions. He's talked with scholars and statesmen, newspaper editors and economists, philosophers and politicians. Tonight, from these priceless film records of that journey, Dr. Smith has drawn together what he believes are America's best answers to another basic problem of our future. Tonight on The Search for America.
I'm Huston Smith. The object of tonight's search is America's morality. The question, what is the nature of right and wrong, and does it matter? Consider the dilemma of a growing child. He has to learn 3 contradictory things at once: to stand up for his rights, to respect the rights of others, and to share with his playmates. What a confusing assignment. A rabbit has no problem, he runs. A tiger has no problem, he attacks. We don't blame the rabbit for being timid or the tiger for being savage. But we are rabbit, tiger, ape, and to some small, struggling degree at least, angel. How to blend these contrary parts is, I suppose, the function of morality. We hear that morals are geographical, that in Russia the end justifies the means, that east of Suez there ain't no 10 commandments. What I wanted to look into was morality in America. Are our morals changing? If so, how? A man I wanted to talk to was Doctor Reinhold Niebuhr, professor of Christian ethics at Union Theological Seminary, but at the time visiting professor at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, New Jersey. And so I drove down to Princeton, and there in an office which was usually occupied by George Kennan, but occupied in his absence by the man I wanted to see, Professor Niebuhr, I came to understand what people had meant in telling me of the bite and perceptiveness of Dr. Niebuhr's mind. Dr. Niebuhr, you have taught ethics for many years. What is morality and what is its function in human life?
Well, etymologically speaking, morality is conformity to the mores. But one knows that that isn't right because the mores may be wrong. So morality always has a double facet. One is conformity to custom, which is a low morality. And let us say the higher morality is, well, the religious people say conformity to the will of God, but that is too arbitrary because everybody can interpret the will of God as he sees fit. So I would think that both the prophets of Israel and the Stoics, or the classical philosophers generally, were right in saying morality is conformity to our the essential structure of human existence. We have the laws of human existence are given in our very being. And morality means realizing these potentialities, conforming to this essential structure.
If I were to ask whether moral laws should always be obeyed, whether it is ever right to disobey them, your answer then would follow this essential distinction.
Certainly, except that one couldn't say moral laws should always be obeyed. You'd say, are there moral laws which derive from the customs? Are there moral laws which derive from the essential structure of human existence? Or are they my interpretation of this essential structure? These are the hazards you face with moral laws. That's why you can't simply say should they be obeyed or should they not be obeyed. Take the two great figures in Western history, in the Christian tradition, Christ, in the classical tradition, Socrates, not Aristotle. Now, Socrates defied the law of Athens. And it's an interesting thing that he willingly went to his death because he said Athens has to have these laws. In effect, he said this. Athens has to have these laws, but I must also defy them. That is, I think, an interesting indication of the double facet of human personality. We have laws according to our relationship to the community, but we also have a freedom beyond the community. And Socrates, in his freedom beyond the community, thought it necessary to defy the community. These are the two dimensions of morality.
Is it possible to describe the moral man apart from any specific content of his actions?
Well, I don't know. I think you could, in a sense, but not one character structure. Significant that on a common sense level, most of the people characterize a moral man as an honest man. We had a former ambassador of England here who made an interesting remark about this matter of morality. He said, I've served His Majesty's government in many climes and cultures which have different conceptions of morality. But I noticed that they all knew the distinction between an honest and a dishonest man. Now, in a way that's right. And on a common sense level, that's what you do. You make a sharp distinction between honesty and dishonesty. But perhaps too sharp. The endless varieties of self-deception that go into this field of honesty and dishonesty make it rather dangerous to make a too sharp distinction. Although a friend of mine, Dr. Erickson, who's a great child psychiatrist, sent me a very wonderful book, or manuscript of a book, that is on this, relevant to this question. It's a study of what he calls the young Martin Luther from a psychiatrist standpoint. And the epilogue makes a comparison which I think nobody has ever heard of before, and that is between Martin Luther and Sigmund Freud. And he says that Martin Luther, whatever his defects, and he mentions his vulgarity and his impetuosity and so forth, ultimately wanted prayer to serve inner honesty. And Freud wanted introspection to serve the same purpose. Now, I think for a quasi-religious, quasi-secular age, this is just what ought to be said.
Very good.
And that, in a way, honesty, including inner honesty, or that's the beginning of all honesty, is the character structure. Now, of course, beyond that, David Hume says the difference between a man whom we approve and a man we don't approve is a difference between a man who is generous and humane to his fellow man and a man who thinks only of himself. That's another facet of morality, which is, I think, basic and transcends all historical and cultural.
Certain largeness.
Certain largeness about it.
Yeah. Let me ask about the sanctions of morality, why we should be good. Often we find it very difficult to behave. Do we do so because we're afraid of being caught, or is virtue in some way its own reward?
Well, as you know, that's a complex problem. There are sociological interpretations of conscience and of virtue that say we are good, or we are what the community regards as good because we're afraid of the sanctions of the community. This is partly true. And we're not talking about what we ought to do, but what we do. We must admit that many of the things we do is because we're afraid of the disapproval of the community. But there is another dimension of moral life that is clearly indicated by the fact that so many people defy the community. Now this, you can't say they ought to defy, but you say, thank God, there are people. Take on the race issue. Here's this tragic race issue wherever two races impinge upon one another, as now and south. Now the community mores on the whole have sanctioned, do sanction segregation. The larger community of America, Constitution, the Supreme Court, says this is wrong. Some people say we must follow this judgment because it's the law of the land. Some people follow the mores of the local community. And some people defy the local community in the name of conscience. Not enough, but many of them do. And many of them who defy the local community in the name of conscience gather a certain strength out of the fact that the national community supports it, and the national community has embodied in its constitution the Bill of Rights, which has a conception of a higher good, liberty and equality, which is part of our Bill of Rights. This is the higher law. So you have these various levels. And I don't think you can say that you will say that men follow all these levels in various ways. And that it's an interesting thing that conscience, on the one hand, is a very individual thing, on the other hand, is a very social thing. There is a possibility, it is individuals to such a degree that an individual may, as an individual, defy a whole community. But there are not very many heroes. On the whole, if an individual defies a community, he constructs another community that will sanction it. In his imagination, he will construct it. You know the story of Thomas More, the great author of Utopia, the great Renaissance figure of Tudor England, King Henry VIII, who was the first, let's say, not the first, but who was an absolute monarch who wanted to bring the church under the supremacy of the state. And More was a good Catholic. He believed in the universal church and the universal community, even though he was chancellor in England. And so when Henry VIII said to him, why don't you submit, because all the bishops and all the clerics have submitted, he said, well, if they have in England, then I appeal to the universal church. And if they would have submitted, then I appeal to the church, militant and triumphant. Now this is, I think, a very interesting statement, indication of the moral problem, because obviously he defied in the name of his own conscience, but he couldn't do it just quite in the name of his own conscience. He had to have some community which would give approval to this, even if it was a community which he partly created in his own imagination. This is, I think, indicative of the double dimension.
The pacifist today might be another example. This goes against the mores of our general community,
Yeah,
but
sure.
appealing to a religious tradition,
Yeah.
say, as the
Yeah.
community
Well, yes, you're quite right. The pacifist, I don't agree with the pacifist, but the pacifist would be another example of this.
Do you think that the good man is the happy man? Do you think that there's any connection between these two?
I think that's an awfully difficult question to answer. It depends upon how one defines happiness. If you define happiness as Aristotle does, the eudaimonia, this is the concomitant and consequent effect of harmony. Any kind of harmony, real harmony, will produce happiness. But since life, a virtuous life, is bound to come in conflict with some of the harmonies of the community, for instance, and perhaps with itself when you think of the terrors of conscience that good people suffer when they think, ought I defy or ought not I defy, then you can't simply equate virtue and happiness. You're going to equate virtue with joy, because joy is not quite happiness. B.R. joy, 3 parts pain. I think that the combination of joy and pain is a more valid consequence of virtue than happiness is. Happiness is a little too neat, a little too simple.
Do you think that immortality or some sort of reward after death is necessary to give morality its full meaning?
I don't know what people would mean about reward after death. I think that the idea of immortality or resurrection, and incidentally in the Christian tradition originally it was resurrection, a very irrational and difficult idea, and so they substituted immortality. Now the immortality is also a rather difficult thing because it comes out of Platonism. The immortal mind is against the mortal body, but we are not mind and body, we are total personalities. What we have is an incongruous human person who both is embedded in the historical process and who transcends it. Rather than talking about immortality or life after death, I would choose, in the Christian tradition, the Johannine concept of eternal life and say, there is such a thing as eternal life, and I would define that as a quality of life which is self-validating despite all historical vicissitudes. And I'm sure that this is a necessity and a possibility for the serenity of men. And you don't have this by any kind of creedal affirmation, because some people who are conventionally religious would stand in terror of death, while other people who are secular and who would reject dogmatic affirmations about life after death would nevertheless have some of this quality of eternal life, so that they could say, whether we live unto the Lord, whether we die unto the Lord, whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. Now we are the Lord's. They might be able to say that. They would say, look, I believe in the meaning of human existence. Whatever meaninglessness there may be in specific areas of life, including my own life, including the fact that I die. This is, I think, a necessity and a possibility of decent existence or serene existence.
Well, this concept of eternal life, then, means that the full rewards of the action are contained within that action and the quality of the attendant feeling, rather than requiring any time gap.
Exactly so.
Later payment of reward.
I think so. I think that's exactly the case.
Dr. Niebuhr, does the concept of a scientific morality make any sense? Does our growing knowledge of the is give any clue as to what the ought should be?
I don't think so. I think it does a lot of. It gives us a lot of indication of how we ought to apply the ought. Maybe maybe it gives some ancillary indication of what the ought should be. Science doesn't tell us, for instance, quote Dewey again, on his maximum of personality and community. They asked him, how do you know that? That's my faith, he said. I think there is a faith in the ultimate ought that you can't scientifically validate. But when you apply this ought, take Dewey's conception again, maximum of community and maximum of personality, and you ask, how is this to be applied in a technical society? How is it to be applied in a pastoral society that's growing into an agrarian society? There are all kinds of social and historical sciences are necessary in order to give a decent application of the ultimate principle to the historical situation.
So if I were to ask whether anthropology, whether psychology, whether any other branch of science has clarified our moral life, how would you answer it?
I would answer just in that way. Of course,
Yeah.
in regard to psychiatry, quite obviously, a matter of inner is clarified a great deal in regard to this matter of inner honesty.
Mm-hmm.
And all the social sciences have clarified it on this matter of community. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's not a scientific principle. That is deeply embedded in our essential being. You would say it like this: that is a law of life, because man is the kind of person who can't be himself within himself. He must always go out from himself to the other. I can't prove this scientifically. I feel this intuitively, if you will. All people feel this intuitively. But if you ask the question, how am I going to love my neighbor as myself? How am I going to come in terms of tolerable harmony with him? Then I need every kind of historical and social science in order to know about the laws of community on this level, on that level. In that sense, we have to have more and more social science and historical science in order to guide us in realizing, let us say, essential humanity under very different circumstances.
Are American morals changing in any significant ways?
Well, in regard to standards, I should say that one of the significant things that I hope will continue is that America, by becoming a world power and becoming conscious of the communal problems of other peoples, is changing its social concept at one particular point. We're becoming less libertarian because we had a very easy time. We had conquered a continent, pushed west, we had the advancing frontiers, so that we rather assumed that liberty would always produce justice. And as far as we assumed that too simply, we cut ourselves off not only from Asia, but from many of our European allies who had a much more difficult problem of establishing a maximum of personality and maximum of community, because the social struggle was much more desperate for them. And I think that our increased experience, and this is referring to your former question, we're living in a larger world where the moral experience of the whole world impinges upon our moral experience, so that there is a gradual adjustment of our libertarianism to the total experiences of mankind. We know that this is a difficult problem to establish justice. Let me use one illustration in political and social morality, and that is the triumph of Eisenhower's new republicanism is against the old republicanism. I'm personally not a particular admirer of our great president, but this is a great achievement of his. He did two things. He adjusted the conservative community of America to our world responsibilities on the one hand. On the other hand, he beguiled them to accept the fact that there must be minimal standards of security for all people in a technical society. This is Eisenhower's new republicanism. You may quarrel with this or that version of it, but this is a significant change in the social and moral climate of the country.
Dr. Niebuhr, do you think this is a moral universe?
Now, that is a little too large a question. Yes, it's a moral universe in the sense that it's a universe governed by law. But it's not a neatly moral universe because it's a universe in which there is freedom. I think it's just as simple as that. The classical philosophers simply said it was moral, and the morality was the laws of nature. And they equated the laws of nature with the laws of history. This is the basic defect, I think, in classical metaphysical interpretations of history. What we have actually is the moral universe which is governed by law, but all this absurd and difficult and creative and destructive human freedom. Now, can you speak about a moral universe that has all these antinomies of destruction in it? Of course, there are symbolic ways of interpreting this and saying that the ultimate morality of the universe roots in the justice and the love of God. This, I think, is ultimately meaningful, but you have to spell it out to make it meaningful in any historic situation.
One of the things Dr. Niebuhr helped me to realize is how funny we human beings are. We can't possibly live alone, and yet we have the greatest difficulty living together. Nobody likes moral codes any more than they like stoplights or no left turn signs. And yet without them, lives would collide and get wrecked, and passions would tangle like rush hour traffic when the policeman isn't there. If the advance of civilization is really marked by the transition from force to persuasion, any hope we can have for true advance in America depends upon a heightening of the moral sensibility of the American people. There's another point, too, and that is that as a civilization grows more complex and mobile, it makes greater demands on the moral sense of its citizens. In village days, a scoundrel couldn't conceal his character for a month, but today, every time I take my car to the garage or have a prescription filled, I have to trust people I don't know about things I don't understand. It may be romantic to hope for a general heightening of the moral capacity of a people as a whole. It may be that in every age, only a handful of men and women can rise to the stature of truly moral beings. But when we see them and the fullness of their lives, we know that this, at least, is what we all were meant to be.
This is National Educational Television.